Marty, Mary Kyle, welcome. Welcome, Alan Hines. Welcome, iPhone. Morning, Lindsay.
Good morning.
Okay, we're officially recording. We'll give another minute or two for RAC members to make their way into the space. So get comfortable, grab some water, whatever you need for our next few hours together. Morning, Cassandra. Corey.
Good morning.
Morning, everybody.
It's looking like we have, it says David's note taker, which may be also listed as Otter AI, which I'm not sure we encourage in this space. And I'm looking at DLCD. I don't know what your kind of policies are, or if that's a actual person. Welcome, Brock. Welcome, Rachel. Ted. Patricia. Morning.
I know that we are in development of an official AI policy that is not currently finalized. I don't know of any limitations on participant note tools. Ethan?
It's fine.
If you're talking to us, Ethan, we're not hearing you.
Oh, yeah, I mean,
We can hear you right now.
okay. Yeah, it's fine. We'll leave them.
Okay. I don't think, Ethan, you might be having audio issues. I heard it's fine, and then maybe a little bit more. Okay, well, why don't we get started? Welcome everybody who's joined. As folks come in, we'll continue to welcome folks, and hopefully by the time we get to roster and roll call, we'll be ready to go. So if we can go, we'll go next slide. Just want to welcome everybody. It's great to see folks again. Just to do a little bit of housekeeping at the beginning, a reminder that this is being live streamed and recorded. We see a number of folks with their cameras on. I'll continue to encourage folks to keep cameras on when possible. I know it's a long meeting, but creating a space and feel of community, even though we're virtual and geographically separated from each other. A couple other reminders: closed captioning is available. So if that's helpful for your participation, you can click the More button if that's what it looks like on your screen, and then there's a Captions or CC icon that you can click for closed captioning. As a reminder, we have Anita. I see you, Anita. There you are. If you have, Anita will be our chat curator throughout the conversation today. So if you have things you want to bring into the room through the chat function, please use that. Anita will track those and bring those comments into the space. We can go, let's do just add, and a reminder just for folks that haven't already changed your name, if you could change your name and affiliation in Zoom. In order to do that, you can hover over your box, click on the kind of three dots, the ellipses, click rename, and identify yourself as appropriate. So let's do a roll call. I'm going to just start first name alphabetical, Alan Lazo. Alan Hines.
Here.
Thank you, Alan. Ann Kelly.
Here. Thank you. Good morning.
Alexandra. I see you.
Alexandra Ring, League of Arkansas.
Thank you. Becky Baxter. So Becky, right? Yep, there you are.
Good morning. Yes, here.
Benjamin Gurwitz. Brandon Persinger. I see you snuck in, Alan, we're on the bees, but I will come back to the A's. Thank you for being here. Brian Rankin. Brock.
Morning.
Yep, morning. Sarah,
Good morning, everyone.
thank you. Chantal,
Morning.
morning. Corey,
Hey, everybody.
morning. Dana,
Here.
thanks, Dana. David Madison,
Good morning.
good morning. Alyssa Gertler. Garrett Pryor. Garrett Stevenson. Gloria Sandoval. Julia Metz.
Morning.
Morning. Kathy Wild.
Morning.
Morning, Kathy. Kelly Hart. Kelly. Lindsay Hutchinson.
Good morning.
Good morning. Lucia Ramirez. Mark Cunningham.
Mac, but present.
Oh, Max, sorry.
No worries.
These dumb eyes of mine making up letters that don't exist. Welcome, Mac. Sorry. Mary Kyle.
Hi, good morning.
Morning. Megan Bolton. Mercedes. Miranda. Patricia Diefendorfer.
Sorry, this is Miranda Bateshaw from the city of Wilsonville. Thank you.
Oh, thanks, Miranda. I'm moving too fast. Patricia.
Present.
Yep, thank you. Rachel Moribidu.
Here, thanks.
Thank you. Ryan Vandenhoof. Samantha Baird. It's Shane, right on time. Shane, welcome. I just saw you enter the room. We're just getting to the S. Shannon,
Here.
thank you. Ted,
Morning.
morning, and Victor.
Good morning.
Okay, did I miss anybody or folks, anybody join after we got?
I
to
just
that part of the
joined. Shane
alphabet?
is here.
Shane, yes, thank you. Welcome.
Yeah, Brian Rankin's here. Brian Rankin's here as well.
Great, thank you, Brian. Anybody else?
Good morning, Alan Lazo's here.
Yep, Alan, thank you. Last call for roll call. Okay, we'll keep an eye out if folks join and mark as present. So thanks, everybody. If we can pull the slides back up. I won't spend a lot of time on this, but just walking through the agenda, as we always do, we'll remind folks and continue our collective challenge to apply racial equity framework to our conversations. And then we'll spend a good chunk of our meeting today in discussion as a RAC around the housing capacity and urbanization. So you'll get an update on the work, and we've really done a lot of effort to create the space for a good discussion around the table. Today we'll take a break, and then you'll get an update from the Housing Action Work Group. We'll close, get you out of here by noon with final thoughts and next steps. If you go to the next slide. As a reminder, just as we share our space together, continuing, and again, you all have done a great job throughout this process, continuing to kind of learn from each other, listening to understand, to maintain a respectful, candid, constructive, right? As an advisory body, your ability to be constructive, to respond to the questions is great, to the extent that you all are able to identify and resolve differences, to find common ground and speak in as a unified set of voices is really helpful for DLCD. Obviously, in a virtual space, it's hard to bring things in the room. It's hard to have a sidebar in a virtual space, but just really asking folks to bring things in, bring things early, avoid surprises, kind of name the things that are coming up for you. As a reminder, both in this meeting, of course, you can provide your input, but always can email housing.dlcd@dlcd.oregon.gov. Thanks, Ellen, for putting in the chat. And then just designate in your message, whether it's own a rulemaking rack, followed by either DLCD staff only or representing public comment. So just appreciate in advance your accordance with that. We can go to the next meeting or next slide. I'll pass it to Ethan.
Thanks, Ben, and good morning, everyone. My name is Ethan Stuckmeyer. I'm the manager of the housing division here at the Department of Land Conservation and Development. Today, at meeting number 12 of this Rulemaking Advisory Committee, which we were recounting earlier, that just kind of how far we've come in this process and where we started in this process and where we are now is something to note. There's a lot of work that we've already done, but also some to go. So today we'll have a conversation focused primarily on a new portion of this local government work when it comes to housing development readiness. Things like how are local governments serving lands and making those and taking those actions that they can to kind of increase the readiness of development in the parts of their communities. So really looking forward to that conversation today. We're going to, as a result of that conversation, deep into development readiness, we'll spend some time talking about the impacts of just urbanization and what it means to urbanize and what it means to plan for housing within our current urban growth boundaries a little bit to kind of set up that conversation. So as we're kind of going through the beginning intro portions of this meeting, be thinking about what you're understanding and how you're coming to this kind of urbanization conversation, and look forward to that discussion with you all. We'll also hear some albeit brief updates on the Housing Actions Work Group topics. That work group is sprinting on now in hopes to get to some milestone dates here in June, and then getting ready for adoption of those housing actions and the work that workers group is doing by the end of this year. So that's all I have for kind of meeting setup. Ben, I will hand this back to you.
Great, thanks, Ethan. And do I sound better now than I did a minute ago? Okay. Couple head shakes. Okay, so if we just before we go forward, just ask if there's any questions or reflections for Ethan. Kind of where we are. Okay. Let's keep going with the slides. So Anita, I'm going to pass it to you.
Good morning, everybody. Anita Yap with Multicultural Collaborative. I'm the racial equity consultant. Just a reminder that as part of this rulemaking, we're required to provide a report to the Commission, LCDC, addressing the racial equity framework for decision making. This was adopted by the Commission in 2023 and has these categories. I'm just going to read them just to remind folks. Addressing historical inequities, benefits and burdens, data equity and data justice, community engagement and empowerment, accountability, restorative justice, decision-making, and measuring and evaluating outcomes and continuous improvements. At the first set of rulemakings, this framework for decision-making was addressed by staff and submitted to the commission. So this second part of the rulemaking will also require this addressing the decision-making framework. Another reminder that I'd like to share with the RAC is that as part of this rulemaking, House Bill 2993, Section 2 amended ORS 183.335 to require a racial equity impact statement. And it needs to be submitted to the Secretary of State. So the statement is required to identify how adoption of the rule will affect racial equity in the state. And this provision applies to any rulemaking notice filed after January 1st, 2022. So a reminder for the RAC folks, if there's some issues that you think could help inform developing this racial equity impact and also the decision-making to the LCDC Commission. It's really helpful. So we want to keep this kind of front and center as we talk about this. So we're going to talk about it at the beginning and also the end and provide some additional prompts if needed. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Anita. So I'm going to just pass it right to Maddie to move us into this conversation. I'm really excited to have. So Maddie, do you want to just jump right in? And
That's great, Ben. Thank you. My name is Madeline Phillips. I'm the Public Facilities Planner here in the Housing Division at DLCD. Friends and colleagues call me Maddie. I don't mind either one. We're going to talk a little bit today. If you move to the next slide, Ellen, thanks. We're going to talk today about a new concept that was introduced into being through statute related to development readiness. And the conversation, I want just to prepare you all, I'm hoping that we can have a conversation to start about everyone's understanding of infrastructure investments or investments in their community. And then we'll go through the concept development readiness and unpacking some of the concepts laid out in the memo. And then we'll have a little bit more conversation about some of the details related to the concept of development readiness. But ultimately, we're here to talk a little bit about what does it mean for land to be development ready, and what are some of the trade-offs that bring us there. Legislatively, the principle we're addressing today is making sure you'll remember from some of our original slides, which I did not include in this presentation today to be concise, is that we're addressing that an issue that housing is not undermined by uncertainty or delay. So what we know about the landscape of Oregon's communities is that there is opportunity to develop things. In fact, cities do buildable land inventories, and we'll get into the dichotomy between buildable land and other things in part of this presentation. But there's an understanding or a concern that buildable land inventoried as a component of a housing capacity analysis may not meaningfully respond to the land needs for near-term housing development. So near-term being immediate needs, a lot of the reason why you all are here helping us with this rulemaking process. And by calling something development ready, a jurisdiction is signaling that elements are in place, typically infrastructure, or there's an absence or a resolution to any encumbrances or impacts to property that might slow down or impede the development of housing. In this way, we're thinking a little bit about real world trade-offs. So land that has a barrier to development has cost, uncertainty, and it may take a lot longer for it to realize its potential. In this case, we're speaking specifically to residential development potential. So jurisdictions make investment decisions, jurisdictions being cities and special districts, folks that help set the table for development to be successful. And they often have to weigh a lot of factors. So we know that there's very, very significant operational and maintenance concerns and costs that are factored into prioritization of investments. And we wonder, or I wonder with you all today, what if housing needs were factored into this equation? And what if housing choices, or perhaps the lack thereof, influenced investment decisions a utility provider or a city makes? And so with that, we'll roll into the next slide. And I'm hoping that we can open a conversation in this way. And so Ben, I'll ask for your help to facilitate this. But the question really is, what are some of the ways that investments in infrastructure have helped your community grow? And if it hasn't been the case that you have an example of that, how do you wish that investments in infrastructure could help your community grow?
yeah, and thanks, Maddie. And you know, we've very intentionally kind of started at this high level. And maybe Maddie, just before we ask folks to kind of jump in, you want to provide just some specific examples, like when you say infrastructure, what are we talking about? What are the type of things that folks can kind of imagine as like, oh, I remember when that came in and it resulted in this, or I remember when we invested that. Right? Can you give a couple of examples?
Absolutely, Ben. So we're thinking about Infrastructure, when we talk about that, we're talking about water, sewer, streets, stormwater facilities in particular. That ties back a little bit to the legislative intent of some of this work, but also speaks to the things that help enable growth in a community. And growth can look a lot of different ways. So growth could look like growing into an area that hasn't been developed yet. So area that is sometimes called greenfield development, and extending utilities into that area and allowing that area to grow up and become housing opportunities. It also means upgrading or improving facilities that are inside of an existing developed area, be it a city, city limits or otherwise. And sometimes that helps create opportunities for more housing choice. So an example might be that there's a lot that has been underutilized or relatively undeveloped for a long period of time, and it was limited by the access to water or sewer facilities. And maybe the city comes through and does a project, or the special district comes through and does a project to upgrade those facilities, and suddenly we're able to see a variety of multifamily housing opportunities in an existing neighborhood. So those are some ways that jurisdictions make investments in places, and those investments have a number of sometimes positive outcomes.
That's awesome. Thank you, Maddie. So as you all think about kind of where you live and what you've kind of observed and witnessed, what's that relationship between kind of growth and investment and infrastructure?
And it can look like a lot of things. So it can look like adding an element of inclusivity to an existing neighborhood. So a neighborhood that's all a single family housing type neighborhood because it was all developed at the same time in the 50s or 60s, that sometimes having an opportunity to add capacity to a water or sewer line changes the development potential of those lands. It also could spotlight areas of town that haven't received very much investment in recent history. So there are some neighborhoods that I can think of in my community of Eugene, but also in other larger metro areas in Portland, where investments in infrastructure have changed the game. The Cully neighborhood is an example that a lot of folks use to think about how can the community influence or encourage a certain direction of development based on certain investment decisions.
Thanks, Maddie. Yeah, Julia, please. Thank you.
Yeah. So the example that I can share was at the time I was working for a nonprofit that developed the first regulated affordable housing in the city of Happy Valley. And the reason that that was finally possible on a site that had been donated to the organization about 10 years prior to that development beginning was because essentially the planned development to the north of that property started to get developed. So the infrastructure, the water, roads, all of that essentially was making its way to the property line finally. So we were able to then afford within the project itself to extend that and then build 143 units of affordable housing for the first time in Happy Valley. So that was pretty exciting. I will say that the project had to pay for all of the infrastructure on that development, which was quite a lift. And the other piece that I really want to call out that made that possible was the Metro Housing Bond. And so because of that additional subsidy, that was how we were able to make that project pencil. And so just layering in terms of this kind of project specific things, it was very exciting to provide affordable housing in a place that didn't have it yet. But the funding and the logistics were the two pieces that really made it possible.
Yeah, thanks, Julia. I mean, it's a really good example, and I think it's going to thread through the rest of our conversation as well, as that relationship between kind of that initial infrastructure, kind of logistics with funding mechanisms to make it pencil out so you can actually build. So that's great. Anita, jump in.
I have a comment from Shane, maybe it's in the chat. It's talking about, I guess, feeling bad about negative on infrastructure has increased displacement. I'm just wondering about kind of what those considerations are as well.
So the relationship between, well, I might put that back on you, Shane, but also hold it up to the group in terms of kind of, have you also seen examples where?
Light insertion, I'll go ahead. I
Yeah.
miscommunicated to Anita. I definitely have multiple examples of how infrastructural development has increased displacement. So the primary example that I'll give is that I lived in a central city concern building that was in the Powellhurst Gilbert neighborhood. It was located close to 115th in Division or 112th in Division. And for me, what I've seen consistently was when the bus rapid transit project was there. Here's the positives before I go on the negative. It absolutely increased transit accessibility. I'm grateful that bus rapid transit existed. Grateful that Portland was able to be second in the region after Vancouver, Washington. Slight read there. But then also the fact is they planted trees, and I was excited that this is bus rapid transit. There's trees there. It's going to increase urban canopy, especially in a place that has really, really bad heat islands, and has been one of the major neighborhoods that have experienced heat stroke and everything just related to that. As the years went on, like a year and a half, and I just was like, wow, the trees are dying. No one watered this. And then the bus rapid transit, I'm grateful that we can bus in more quickly into the playgrounds of the cities. But for me, the metaphor that I end up giving, or the analogy, is a built road versus a gravel road with potholes, or an English garden versus a wild native habitat. There are certain kinds of people that can see life and diversity within a natural ecology or something that's more rough. Many people who move to Portland think that they have this ethos and aesthetic, but at the end of the day, that relates to class distinctions. And I just feel every time there's bus rapid transit, there's urban canopy, there's fixing potholes, I have always felt fear, because it has felt like several times within my life that when infrastructural developments are occurring, because of the decades of lack of housing, the rising wealth inequity, and the fact that we are a national destination for national and international investment, there's such a dearth of housing that's available. So trying to build the infrastructure and get it is a good goal, but it's almost like then that makes people who have more access to capital be like, ooh, that neighborhood is finally doable. I was raised in Clark County, and when I finally found out people would finally move to downtown Vancouver because it had a waterfront and a bus rapid transit system, I was like, oh, you only care about our communities when it's as easily accessible to your yuppie experience as possible. That's my experience of it. And maybe that's negative, maybe it's too anecdotal, but it just constantly feels like when infrastructure is made within a year or 2 years, that neighborhood becomes exclusive to me, someone who's only made less than $30,000 a year in my life. So that's my comment.
Yeah, no, thanks, Shane. And I think you're naming, I mean, a couple things that we'll have to be holding as a RAC as we have this conversation, right? Kind of the benefits and burdens, right? We started, as Anita's challenged us every time, to think about these policy concepts and issues through a racial equity framework. And so while we're thinking about, this duality of what, Julia, I think you described as infrastructure that opened up the pathway to affordable housing, not being, not seeing that as the only reality. And Shane, I think you've given us a really good set of anecdotes that demonstrate where it can be.
Thank you. And just one final comment. I can be very, very aware, even though I try to research and I try to separate my emotions and my deep trauma related to displacement, I can understand how emotional sensitivity and trauma can cause us to have a very granular, narrow focus. However, I beg my people who have more comfort and a wide focus to understand the urgency that we feel. And if people on the ground do not feel a sense of social capital that's being created for us and crafted with interstitiality, then it just feels like I don't actually believe what you're doing, and every building that's being built is a unit that I can't afford. So I'm just trying to learn, how can we see the forest for the trees and analyze deep traumatic elements and psychological burdens that have been placed unfairly on marginalized communities.
Yeah, thank you for naming that, Shane. Mac?
Yeah, thank you. I kind of want to build on some of the comments that Julia had earlier and then also what Shane was just talking about. First touching on what Shane was just kind of discussing there. I think one of the dynamics that we're really naming here, and I also want to be explicit about this, is that gentrification and displacement gets triggered not when the infrastructure opens. It begins when the project is announced. And so it's really upstream of that. The BRT opening on Division didn't cause gentrification, and it was a trigger, but that bus line opening wasn't the catalyst. It was much, much earlier. And I kind of just want to draw attention to that and also underline within that that is another reason why investments in affordable housing prior to these projects coming online in these communities is critical to offer regulated opportunities for folks to be able to remain in place and not face that displacement. So that's the first one. And the second one, yes. So those infrastructure investments that Julia was talking about are really important. I was a coworker of Julia then, so that was a really exciting project. And yeah, just to underline that, it took like 10 years and multiple different folks all looking at that project. And then once those investments to the north of the site came in, it became feasible. But I also want to highlight a little bit about how infrastructure investments placed on housing projects, particularly affordable housing projects, can kill housing and deny housing choice and opportunities in communities. I have been working on, for the last couple of years, a development which is currently under construction in the Portland Metro in one of the suburbs. It's an infill site. It was a greenfield location, which meant some infrastructure investments, of course, would be necessary. When the jurisdiction subdivided this lot, which made this parcel available, there was not a lot of coordination between planning staff and engineering. The land use report from Planning Commission dividing the lot identified a variety of routes for bringing utilities, including in the existing right-of-way, which was going to get extended. We made a development proposal. We baked funding off those assumptions, which had been approved by the jurisdiction. We went in for a land use. For a pre-application, they were like, I don't necessarily love this, but didn't say exactly what they wanted. And so once we finally got in for formal land use, about 3 months after that, the city finally said, actually, all of those assumptions for how you want to bring sewer and stormwater to the site are wrong. We want you to switch to gravity lines. And so that required getting a new easement across several different property lines to bring in that investment. That delay from not getting information on the city, needing to do a redesign, working through negotiations with the property owner, delayed the project from closing by over 9 months, added several $1 million in costs, and we lost millions of dollars in tax credit equity because our closing was delayed. And so even within those infrastructure requirements, it felt like a Christmas tree. It was like, oh, we want you to bring this here. And then the jurisdiction said, by the way, can you build us a utility access road over top of that? That was money that we did not have on the project, and it led to a scramble in the last minute of trying to plug from other different sources to get that to work because of existing subsidy caps that exist within funding programs. And so infrastructure investments are really important. Of course, they catalyze and make opportunities for new housing, such as the example Julia made possible, but also requiring those infrastructure investments to be carried on the backs of projects presents real problems, particularly when they're affordable housing. At least in the Portland metro area, a lot of the easy, low-hanging fruit development sites, they're developed. And now what we're left with is a lot of more challenging ones with slopes, wetlands, lack of utility access, and the like. And affordable housing, more often than not, is given the leftovers of what market rate is like. That's too hard. I don't want to have to do that. And so that then increases the project cost that we all have to carry to bring these developments online and help preserve access to affordable opportunities in communities. And so I also want to name that dynamic within this whole conversation of, yes, it's great when we have new developments come in, increase and bring in those infrastructure investments, but some projects can't carry those like others. Thank you.
Thanks, Mac. And y'all are teeing up, again, the kind of thread of conversation that we'll be having throughout this morning. Julia, your hand was up and then went down. You good?
Yeah, I was just gonna say something real quick. Mac had started to touch on it, but kind of related to what Shane was bringing up. I also just want to note the importance of kind of I know I'm kind of scope creeping here outside of the the topic, which is why I put my hand down. But the importance of remembering to kind of pair those different tools. So things like essentially the reason that affordable housing was able to be built on the property in Happy Valley I was talking about versus maybe something else was essentially because the organization had been land making that land. And so again, those kind of the order of operations is really key, which was Mac was starting to touch on that a little bit of um, if the state or the city or whoever is actually going to be providing those investments up front in terms of getting the infrastructure to greenfield sites or just sites in general.
I had a couple comments to share. One of sparked interest in facilitating upper floors of older buildings so they can be used for housing. And then another comment, and I'd like to offer for Shane to share a bit, but just about especially lived experience for folks who are living in there, talking about displacement. I would say from my perspective, yes, it happens way before, but people that are experiencing it on lived experience really have a different perspective. So Shane, would you like to share a little bit more about your comment about the downstream?
Trying to hold sensitivity for different kinds of experiences, but it's related to what Mac said, where I'm trying to learn Mac and just take new information. I just didn't know about that in relation to the effects of downstream, right? I guess maybe there's a potential as we go in this process for communicating even more to marginalized communities about these effects. Because if I'm at the bottom of a waterfall, it doesn't matter to me where the rain or the spring started. The spring may be the thing that originated the water, but the spring is bubbling and clear and true, and I'm just feeling bullets on my face. So I just wanted to state that, not in form of any disrespect. I'm just trying to intake the information that you provided new to me, but just context. And thank you, Anita. I appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks, Shannon. I always appreciate the metaphor as just a really wonderful way of describing kind of both these experiences all along that continuum. Thank you, Anita. Was there Corey? Was that your comment? Or no, Chantal. So let's go to Becky, then Shannon, then Ann, then Corey.
And mine's just more of a clarification when there's conversation about affordable housing. Some of the legislation that we're following that will potentially provide some housing infrastructure provides a definition of affordable housing as any housing that's 120% and below area median income. And I think there's often, even within the initial legislative concept, the term was used interchangeably with 60% and below area median income. So just so we all know, I just guess I would like to have somebody share when they're sharing affordable housing, what do they mean? To me, from what I'm learning, and again, I'm learning as well, to me, affordable is anything that isn't market rate. So it's affordable to whoever is being served. So that might be persons that are very low poverty that would be in a subsidized housing situation, or it might be workforce housing that's your 80 to 120% AMI, your nurses, your firefighters, early police officers, school teachers. So I just want to say when we're talking affordable, I think it's good we keep in mind that that could be somebody that is 80 to 120% or 30% and below. So just a comment. Thank
Yeah, it
you.
might be a big question, a big conversation. I mean, I'm looking at our DLCD team, what I hear, Becky, is maybe a distinction. There's subsidized, affordable market. Is there I don't know, Maddie, then I'm looking at the two of you when we think about or talk about affordable housing, is there a definition that we should be using or a way to be holding it? Or does it kind of run the gamut of everything that's not market can have a range of different types of affordable housing? Is that kind of the way to accept it? Okay. So
Yeah,
Becky.
it's more of the latter then, and I think there, sometimes we talk about things as capital affordable housing, which is often a subtle reference to subsidized housing. But then there are also lots of varieties of ways that housing under 120% AMI comes into being, which can include a variety of incentives and private development that comes to the table to do that work. So it can really vary a lot.
Great.
Thanks for clarifying.
Thanks, yeah, thanks for just putting it out there, Becky. Let's go Shannon and Corey.
Well, I'm just going to try to go back to that, I think, initial question and think of a couple of positive examples. So one, as a representative of many rural-based nonprofit affordable homeownership developers, and who are we serving still today on average statewide? Right around 46% of the area median income is our average home buyer. So we might go up to 80% and we might go lower to 30%. But we're still averaging on that low end with homeownership, and we have a 98% loan repayment rate. So it's not your typical model, and we're not allowed to use tax credits, right? So today, at least federal tax credits, maybe some movement with our Oregon affordable housing tax credits. So it's a very different kind of model. It's a tough model to bring to scale. It often takes like deep local partnership. And I think what I want to just like say with my out loud voice is a strength of this weird network that is Habitat for Humanity is that we're in specific communities for decades because some of this work is intensely relational. And in fact, some years ago, I published like a local advocacy toolkit for Habitat affiliates. And I was like, every advocacy begins with a story. We have lots of stories to tell, like go meet the people who work at your cities where you start, like meet them, talk to them. They are people. They're pretty nice. Talk to them, and I bring this up, right? Because like Jennifer Anderson, who's building homes in St. Helens and Scappoose right now, there's this parcel that I've been to see with Bonamici on site, right, where there are going to be 10 townhomes. It's their first denser site. It's in an existing residential neighborhood. They are the second, if not third, I believe only second nonprofit who's owned the site for 10 years. Right, for 10 years, the site that's like in this beautiful flat, I mean, not like 15% flat residential neighborhoods with like trees and homes where there are going to be 10 townhomes. What's been in the way of that is that the sewer on both sides, because there are streets on both sides of where these townhomes are going to go, the whole sewer lines need to be replaced, right? And like up until now, or recently, cities have put that on the builder. Like, oh, sure, you can build this infill lot. We'd love to see townhomes. Only, yeah, here's the thing. We need you to replace 6 blocks of sewer lines on both streets. Well, now the project doesn't pencil, especially if you don't get tax credits, right? But the city is like, oh, we need to replace the sewers on both sides of those streets. Like we've been garnering capital for that. Habitat, we're so excited you own this parcel now that various nonprofits have wanted to build home ownership on for 10 years. We're going to work with you. We're going to work with you to bring the sewer lines down both sides of this parcel that you own because we're so excited and we know we need these townhomes and we want these townhomes. But like, that didn't happen for 10 years. Like I also want to say, like, it's a happy story now, but it didn't happen for 10 years for whatever reasons, and we kind of had this outmoded model of like, of course, system development charges and builders, like that's how you replace aging out sewer lines. Like, no, it never worked. Like it never really worked. It didn't let you bring in affordable homes, right? Maybe if you're building McMansions, you can pay for those 6 streets of sewers on two streets, but not with affordable home ownership, right? But it's a good story and it's a happy story, and I'm so grateful. And there have been delays on both sides, kind of predictably, but still, wow, a winning partnership. And I know I've told this story in various ways before, but again, just have to shine a light on the great work happening in LeGrand. local improvement district, they are killing that. Like they're killing it. So not only did they say like, oh yeah, sure, you can talk to all the neighbors and then you can like pay us a lot of money and we'll come in. They're like, we will come in when we get a break in our schedule. The city, we're just gonna do this. Like we're gonna hire the subs and we're gonna do these improvements. We're gonna bond it. We usually charge interest, but you're a nonprofit serving this very low AMI. It looks like they're not going to charge us interest and they're going to let us pay them off proportionally as we sell the homes we build that have frontage on that street. So like we have no carrying costs for that infrastructure. That's amazing. Like that was that affiliate again. Like I'm not trying to say we're geniuses or perfect. Clearly not. Volunteer run affiliate, right? They've owned that land for like 8 years. Doing that little tiny road cut through was totally intimidating to them, right? For getting what are now going to be 14 modular homes built. Like kind of a blessing it was a delay because earlier we would have only been allowed to build 4 homes. Yay, middle housing, right? But like that's an amazing. So I mean, there's some hope, right? Like I do see this momentum around our state of some cities like leaning in and saying like, oh, that has been a barrier. There's some things we can do around that. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you, Shannon. You all are doing a great job of kind of teeing up the conversation that this was kind of the warm-up question, right? To give some context and give some examples, and you're really kind of setting the tone for the discussion that we're going to get to. They'll get deeper and deeper into the kind of rule and technical aspects of the stories that you're hearing now. Let's go Ann, Corey, Anita, and then I'm going to ask Maddie to come back in and move us into the next part of the conversation.
But going back to the initial question, this is more about precluding all housing development in our experience at Washington County in terms of lack of infrastructure in certain areas, which of course precludes affordable housing, whether it's small a or capital A. But for a very long time in our northeastern area, running right up Park, or actually up against Forest Heights neighborhood on the other side of the county line. We were without sewer line for a very long time, and that meant that nobody could develop housing in a large area, McDaniel Road, 113th. There was another area, Bonnie Slope West, that was part of Multnomah County that couldn't get services because of Forest Park. So we did a very odd thing, and Washington County annexed from Multnomah County to provide sewer to that area, which then was developable. And we still have a large area, North Cooper Mountain, without sewer trunk line, where people have been urbanized for decades and still can't develop. So, I mean, Washington County is has a very large urban unincorporated area and a very large population. But when you don't have infrastructure in certain areas, it can be very limiting as to where you can provide any housing to serve a population. So I just wanted to bring that forward because infrastructure improvements definitely unleash possibilities for housing of all kinds, affordable and otherwise.
Awesome. Thanks, Ann. Corey?
Yeah, thanks. My comments are going to mirror Ann's a bit. So I think just a kind of slight tweak on on this question is, what are some of the ways investments in infrastructure could help our community grow? Because I think here in Bend in Central Oregon, we have quite a few examples that illustrate that. And we've got literally thousands of units of housing of all types stuck behind a number of infrastructure investments in our central core area, but then also in our expansion areas. And so I think for me, what, this question brings up is that I think what, these development ready land inventories are going to show us is something that I think a lot of cities and jurisdictions and advocates are well aware of, which is that so many parcels are stuck behind some kind of infrastructure investment, whether it's a site-specific, project-specific investment or a larger capacity, system level improvement. I think that's really what's going to be borne out in these inventories and something we already know. And I think just wanted to put a few specific examples in the room of where we could be really growing well and with intention and creating complete communities, but we really are lacking some of these key infrastructure investments to get to that, to the actual building. So thanks.
Thank you, Corey. Anita?
I have a couple comments. Julia said this is having to do with kind of the term affordable housing. Julia said, if it's useful when I say regulated affordable housing, I mean 0 to 60% AMI in terms of public funding based affordable housing. So I think that discussion earlier about what does affordable housing mean from definition, thank you, Julia, for that clarification. And then a comment from Miranda, which probably will be our pivot as well, is can you provide more specificity on how this discussion is informing rules that will be drafted, and what portion of the future rules are we discussing? Big question, not sure how to answer this in a meaningful way and helpful way.
Shane, you snuck a hand in there right when I was ready to pivot, but yeah, jump in and then Maddie.
It's just a quick question. This is related to the dashboard of how information would be communicated, I believe, to the public regarding, just all the data we have. So this seems like a really important one where if I would recommend maybe a little circle, some kind of visualization method so people can see and understand if there's like buildable land inventory and then there's development ready land and someone is like, just a tiny proportion of it, it might be good just to show color differential, because then it's like, oh, there's a wide difference between the proportion of, hey, most of our development ready land is, buildable land, BLI is development ready versus the opposite. And then that might just give more empathy and immediate understanding for anyone who's trying to invest specifically in those regions or municipalities.
Awesome. Thank you, Shane. All right, Maddie, back to you.
I couldn't think of better pivot opportunities. Thank you, Shane. Thank you, Miranda, for your question. And thank you, everyone, for your comments. My ambition here was to get everyone's thoughts flowing on this idea of development readiness, how it can help facilitate the types of developments we hope to see in Oregon related to housing choices, and thinking about how complex the topic is, infrastructure investments, that is, and how development readiness might be a great measure of where cities are ready for housing investments and where folks can really count on that resource being available versus holding property for 10 years, like Shannon shared and Mac also, and really leaning into the creativity that Ann Kelly mentioned around how might we overcome certain barriers. I think you'll see that when combined with other tools, zoning, incentives, that there's potential to broaden housing choices in existing neighborhoods and areas in the community that we'll hopefully see on our inventories. Just to ground us really briefly, you remember this graphic of the Oregon Housing Needs Analysis Goal 10 work. I share it here only so that you can see where we are. If we flip to the next slide, Ellen. We'll move into, we're looking specifically at where development ready land inventories lands in that process. So we're assessing land capacity and development readiness. And it's critical that we talk about the investment opportunities inside incorporated or existing UGBs, and in those places that were identified to also be included. So I don't want to forget our partners in counties that were called out specifically in certain legislation that will also be responsible for doing the work that we'll be discussing, development ready land inventory. So as we get into the presentation some more, I'll make sure to make those specific references. But I want us to remember that something that rings in my ears from early in my career that a city attorney and I discussed very frankly was that zoning is a promise, that when land is zoned for a certain use or a certain density, we hope that cities can deliver or jurisdictions can deliver on what that is zoned for and that it's able to be developed. And I think development ready land inventory seeks to show that and ask that question ahead of individual inquiries. So you heard from a number of folks who shared, thank you so much for those examples, about times when their organization or they as an applicant came to a jurisdiction and asked the question, what do I need to do if I want to develop this property? This is a question on an individual property. We're hoping that we ask this question through the whole jurisdiction so that we're really getting to the preparedness element for jurisdictions to think about what might we need to share with folks that come in and inquire. Helen, will you flip to the next slide, please? Specifically making this dichotomy between buildable land and development ready land. So just to draw the bright line between buildable and development ready land, it's easy to mix them up. Buildable land is a 20-year planning horizon. We're thinking about areas within an urban growth boundary. So it's a larger geography. We're also thinking about how that feeds into the housing capacity analysis and the city's enumeration of how much capacity it has within its urban growth boundary. And it supports defining a need. And the need it defines is how much land a city has available and how much capacity it can hold for residential development. And in the event that a city or jurisdiction finds that it is deficient in land, in a buildable land inventory, it moves through a growth boundary amendment process, which is different and very distinct from development ready land. Development ready land is meant to look specifically at a shorter window, that 6 or 8 year supply in meeting the own a housing target, and specifically informs an assessment of near-term capacity. So what's really ready? What's really available within that window? You heard a number of folks use the time frame of 10 years. And that's not an unfamiliar time frame, unfortunately, related to housing development. I think where we're hoping we get to in the development ready land inventory is the ability for a city to show on a map how much of that land, how much of that buildable inventory is actually ready within the HPS window, is actually ready to meet their housing target. And so this work will inform selection of housing production strategies, not the urban growth boundary amendment, because we've assessed that at the 20-year time horizon. This is a short turnaround, 6 or 8 year timeline, and it informs housing production strategies in that shorter housing target window. Let's talk a little bit about how the legislature defined development ready, and we'll unpack that definition as we go through. If you can flip to the next one, Ellen. The development ready land, you'll see this definition in the memo as well, and I'll walk through the definitions here. I'll also provide a little bit more unpacking of the areas that we need to clarify within the definition. So thank you to the technical advisory committee members that have helped with this, from the capacity and urbanization TAC. Further, there's been some work with an infrastructure subgroup of volunteers who signed up for even more meetings to talk about infrastructure. Thank you to those folks as well, just at the top of this discussion. And we're thinking about development ready lands means buildable land that are likely to support the production of housing during the period of their housing production target, because they are annexed and zoned to allow for housing through clear and objective standards and procedures. They are readily served through adjacent public facilities or identified in the near term through an adopted capital improvement plan, and not encumbered by any applicable local, state, federal protective regulations, or have appropriate entitlements to prepare the land for development. So you'll see all these bold terms. These are all terms that we have to unpack and define. And so we'll move through some of those in a more conversational way, but I just want you to be aware that each of these terms has some really specific meaning, and that's where the rules that you'll see in your attachment A to the memo will come in handy. So if that's helpful to have available while we're having the conversation, please don't hesitate to ask questions. I see a hand. Alan?
Yeah, Yeah, I was wondering if you could talk about density in terms of new buildable land. I know that the only way that we can require accessible housing is when it's zoned for high density buildable land. So I'm just wondering if you could explain where that fits in with this. Or if it doesn't. Thank you.
Absolutely, Alan, it does. Because in both the buildable land inventory and the development ready land inventory, there is a requirement that a jurisdiction calculate the capacity of the land. And capacity is likely a function of how dense land is zoned. So you'll see an example later in the presentation where we talk about achieving the capacity that a site is zoned for, and or the inability for that site to achieve density because of something like an infrastructure capacity limitation. So if you'll humor me, I think we're going to come back to that, and if you'll remind me to speak to that a little bit more at that time, I appreciate it very much.
Thank you.
Wonderful. Ellen, if we could move on to the next slide, please. I thought that it would be effective to show an example of the difference in mapping an area of a city from buildable land inventory to develop a proposed or example development ready land inventory. This is the city of Salem, and we borrowed this work so that we could just make a visual example. This is not an actual development ready land inventory for that city, but it illustrates some really important points. The buildable land inventory you'll see on the left has a series of parcels colored in different colors for what they're zoned for. And Alan, that's where the density of those opportunities comes into play, because each of those colors notates a different kind of zone, which might have a different level of density. And that's what a buildable land inventory intends to do. It looks throughout the whole urban growth boundary of a municipality and says, where is there land available that's buildable, that still has capacity, both vacant and partially vacant. What development ready land inventory looks at is not just, is that land available, but is it served? And is it annexed and zoned for the appropriate use, residential uses? And is it unencumbered, or is it encumbered? And does that play a role in whether or not a city or jurisdiction determines that they have enough land to meet their short-term, their near-term housing target? And you'll notice that in the development ready land inventory map, or this segment of a map, that a lot of the land that was identified as buildable is grayed out. And that means that it is not development ready per the very cursory look that we took, which had to do with service proximity and the eligibility of whether the land was included within the city limits, annexed and or zoned for residential use. So you'll see that the difference between these two results, different inventories, will be fairly significant for most cities. If we can move to the next slide, please, Ellen. And further, just to give some more, to round out the statutory guidance that we're following, is that in ORS 197A210, we hear about timing. So when a jurisdiction is required to do a development ready land inventory, and who is required to do a development ready land inventory. Cities and jurisdictions that are notably required to do a BLI are also required to do a development ready land inventory. And they shall do it when they've done their buildable land inventory. That said, it informs their housing production strategy, and we can talk a little bit more towards the end of the presentation around what a city or jurisdiction does if they result in a deficiency of development ready land. So if a jurisdiction determines that it does not have enough land and or capacity within that land to support its own housing target in that 6 or 8 year timeline, what ought it do? And we'll talk a little bit about that towards the end. We move to the next slide, Ellen. Before I move into the areas of clarification, are there any initial clarity questions or comprehension questions, reactions that anyone would like to share?
Yeah, Brian. Sorry. Yeah, Brian, jump in.
Yeah, just a few thoughts. I mean, just for us to recognize that on all of these maps, we can identify lands that meet a certain qualification that would say they're development ready. So you have your BLI, which is a land status, and then you have the development ready, which is a subset based on probably the proximity of infrastructure. And that's a pretty good approximation, but for us to know that it doesn't mean a developer who owns that land will actually develop. Right, a developer can just sit on land. They don't have to do, the city can't compel them, you shall go develop your land now, right? That's just not how the system works. You can provide incentives, you can streamline, you can do all the things, but so there's a lot of ambiguity in this. I just want to kind of highlight that. It's not as predictive, it's a best guess. And so in that kind of line of reasoning, I notice there's an exclusion of land that is inside an urban growth boundary, but outside of the city. And there are cases that I am personally, professionally aware of that land that's in the UGB can be annexed, master planned, and come online faster than some of the lands that are currently inside the UGB. So I don't know if that exclusion on lands that are not yet annexed is really helping the cause. Because there are immediately serviceable parcels that can come in within that window. So that exclusion seems very coarse to me and may not really, it may not be appropriate in all cases. A city would still have to prove it. But I don't see that distinction as being, I just don't think it's in service of the cause of saying, do we have enough development ready land? And then also the CIP, having a CIP, capital improvement program, be the one of the primary drivers for defining what is going to be serviceable. CIPs are over like a multi-year period, a 2-year or 5-year, or sometimes a 10-year period, which means the infrastructure, just because a project's in the CIP doesn't mean that that's actually going to get built until year 2, 3, 4, or 5, right? So again, you're like kind of at the end of your window. And just using the CIP doesn't account for a developer who doesn't have, a project's not in the CIP, but say they need sewer. Okay, but a developer's like, I'm going to build on my property. I'm going to build that sewer line for, whatever, quarter mile, 200 feet, 700 feet, whatever it might be. So developers themselves are often willing to make these investments. And so the map wouldn't show that necessarily. If you have a piece of land that's isolated, say it's doesn't have sewer immediately adjacent to it or doesn't have water immediately adjacent to it, this mapping exercise and this approach wouldn't capture the fact that there are developers that are willing and able to do that. So I don't know how we account for that in the analysis. So I just wanted to mention those things really quick. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Brian. Maddie, you want to reflect back or?
No, we can go right to Mary Kyle, and I'd be happy to circle back to some of these comments that are shared as they're relevant in some of the presentation to follow.
Yep. Thanks, Maddie. Mary Kyle?
I'm not sure where this comment fits, but I think it's here. But Maddie's remark about how land use zoning is a promise, I think that was what was just made me reflect on what we heard from like Mac and Shannon earlier, that there's something that I don't know if we can get at in this rulemaking, but it would be great that's about the coordination between the land use planning and the engineering aspect, the public works. And we hear stories of lots of frustration about that lack of coordination. Either it takes so much time for engineering and public works, or you get put through what Mac did of you think it's going to be that this is the route it's going to take or the type of infrastructure, and it ends up being something else or whatever. And the land use planning program usually bears the burden of the blame for those glitches when it's not. And there's some coordination that if we're saying it's development ready land and we're going to fulfill that promise, and engineering and public works play a key part in that, there has to be something more to make that connection real. And I know we're seeing reflections of this frustration in various pieces of legislation this session about, just telling public works to do it faster. I don't know if that's a solution, but there just has to be some coordination, because to make it actually development ready, and particularly to deliver it at a predictable and perhaps relatively more affordable price, there just has to be something going on there. And I don't know what the solution is for that, but I see that's an area for clarification and coordination that's more than just planning. It is planning it, but in any event.
Thanks, Mark. So same thing, Maddie, probably try to incorporate some of that. Yeah, okay, David?
So I just wanted to carry on with what Brian had mentioned earlier. And I also wanted to go into, the irony of this whole thing with the shovel-ready sites and things takes me back 10 years to when everyone did an economic opportunity analysis for commercial-ready projects. And, here on the coast in Tillamook County, we did that, and there finally was some development 8 years ago at the port, but large scale commercial developments haven't materialized yet. And now that could have been where we had properties identified, shovel ready properties identified everywhere, development ready properties for commercial uses identified everywhere. And now that's flipped over, and here we are in residential. So I just wanted to throw that little caveat.
Yeah, thank you, David.
Thanks for those additional comments, all. I'm very appreciative of bringing all of those perspectives into this conversation, and they are certainly things that we are wrestling with respect to legislative intent in the statute and the implications it has on rule and how cities operationalize some of this work. So I'm going to walk through 4 areas of clarification that are all included in the discussion memo that was shared in the packet. I'll also get to explanation of some of the terms that are shared in those as we come to them, and I'll also try to tie back to some of the comments that were made. Ellen, if you could move into the next slide, please. When we talk about readily served by adjacent public facilities, yes, Brian, it's a proximity question. Some of those proximities are going to be areas that are not annexed into the city. We also know that when utilities are in close proximity to those parcels, it's a lot easier to move through the annexation process because it's clear what the expectations are, what the connection requirements will be. I think one of the ways that we're hoping jurisdictions utilize the development ready land inventory is to use it as a tool to set the table for near-term residential development success, anticipating what are the connection requirements that folks who might own property within proximity of perhaps the city limits, or otherwise in proximity to existing facilities that are perhaps a little farther away. What are the requirements going to be for those parcels? And how might we do a better job, to Mary Kyle's point, of coordinating how those engineering expectations and standards are translated through a pre-application meeting or in the process of annexation agreement development. So there are some really good clarification opportunities with the term readily served. I think we took a step back to think about what does readily serve and or what does the term near term mean, and you'll hear me speak to that in the next concept. But we're really thinking about some of the concerns around capacity limitations and how might some of those physical barriers or issues with undersized facilities or limited facilities impact the success of particular development interests. You'll also see some more unpacking of capacity and achieved density in the memo discussion. Achieved density is something that is used in the buildable land inventory, and it describes, I'll get into that later, but it describes how much capacity is estimated on land in certain areas. And I think one of the biggest concerns raised by our TAC members was what happens if it's served, and it can be served at the minimum density, so it is development ready, but it has a capacity limitation. It can't really achieve the density that other areas zoned the same can achieve. And how might we share that or build expectations around that so that folks don't find out or be surprised when they walk into the development counter at a community with plans and expectations and ideas of grandeur of doing a great residential development, and find out that they're really limited by the service available to those sites. Let's move into the next slide, please, Ellen. Using the term identified for near-term provision in a capital improvement plan, an adopted capital improvement plan. Now, this is where we get a lot of variation. Brian, thank you for raising this question or concern. Near-term means within that HPS time window, so not a 20-year time horizon. We're still talking about that 6 or 8 year window. Just to use as an example, and to work it back, you'll see in the memo it's shared as well that if a city or a jurisdiction has an 8-year HPS window, which is everyone outside of Metro, we're being we took maybe this is just a way of thinking about it, but I think it's fairly generous to say that an infrastructure project can be built in a year and a housing project can be built in a year following. Now, you've heard conversation and anecdotes to the contrary to this, but just to give everyone the benefit of the doubt that an infrastructure project can be built in a year and a housing project can be built in a year. So those projects, in order to count towards the buildable land inventory, have to start by year 6 in order for them to really qualify within the HPS window of time. Similarly, I think it would be really challenging to justify, we know that capital improvement plans change are very dynamic. Outside money or legislative appropriations, grant dollars really affect the capital improvement planning or capital improvement program of a lot of jurisdictions. So I think where you'll see sensitivity to the capital improvement plan and any extension of that could be a financially constrained list within a utility document. So in the transportation world, that's really common to have a subset of projects that you have funding for because of the funding sources available. Other cities do work more as a budgetary process where they adopt a document as part of their budget on an annual basis. These are all within the window of available opportunities for being considered capital projects. The idea is, how can we show that on a map that's perhaps in contrast to what we see as readily served or served today? And I think that there's just a little bit of concern. I know I certainly had it as a former local government planner, that if we make a map that shows 2 parcels, one of which is served today and can be built on today as someone walks in the door, versus a capital project that is on the CIP, it's high priority, but gosh, what if we get outside money and we turn to a different project because we get $3 million to do a water line somewhere else and we don't get to that in the 5-year window? Should these 2 properties be identified on the map the same? And I think you'll see in the rules that the technical advisory committee and the infrastructure subgroup both thought that there were good reasons to show that in slightly different notation or coloration or somehow else, just to manage expectations that we're really making an earnest effort that those capital projects will be built and therefore bring online a whole bunch of land that's available for residential development, but it's really contingent on a public investment. And that could be borne by a private developer and receive SDC credits, but it's really waiting for a bigger action that is beyond the stewardship of the one landowner. I think I saw a hand go up. I want to make sure that
I don't know if there was a hand, and I wanted to lift up, you had put something in the chat that gets to this kind of relationship of capital and kind of housing versus capital and safety and prioritization. So, Anne, do you want to kind of speak to what you were naming?
Oh, thank you. Yeah, I didn't want to take too much time, but often these capital improvements are prioritized based on safety issues, especially roads, which can include sewer improvements. So it can be less about development potential than existing safety needs.
Yeah, just thanks for naming it, right? People have talked about kind of how do we create this stronger relationship between kind of public utility and investment and housing development, while there's other priorities that are also informing those investments. Brock?
Yeah, and sorry for the funky camera angle. Our power just went out, so I rejoined from my phone. Would it make sense to have, so we have that kind of like 2-year period that Maddie was talking about, right? One for infrastructure, one for development. Would it make sense for cities to update their development ready lands inventory in either year 4 or 6, I guess, depending on whether or not they're in metro, to essentially remove from the development ready land inventory the lots that would have been served by projects that no longer are on track for completion in that time? Is that too much of a burden considering that you'll be doing it again 2 years later? Just want to get thoughts from the collective group, I guess, on that.
Yeah, so this would be kind of updating during that period and kind of the weight of what kind of burden that would be when you had to redo that analysis so recently after. Yeah, Maddie, do you have thoughts?
Brock, I think it brings up a great point, which is, making good on the promise of making the map and saying this is what our intention is. And I think there are certainly good reasons why your request isn't unfounded. I think what we'll find is that jurisdictions that are required to do a development ready land inventory will start updating their maps when they make those big decisions that shift a capital plan. So for example, and I guess just to maybe reemphasize that the development ready land inventory is a tool to building a conversation in a community around what can we earnestly expect in this near term window, and what are the ways that our decision making is influenced by the availability or lack of availability of land opportunity. And so I'm sure that you'll find that communities will start to make dynamic changes to the work that they prepare. And whether or not a city or jurisdiction wants to make that document truly public, I mean, it's always public because it's part of the record, but whether or not that's something that's published in a newsletter or not is something to be determined. I think predominantly folks would likely use it internally as a tool to work within and coordinate with engineering, public works, and land use so that expectations are somewhat accurate. That said, I don't know what the answer is specifically to your question, Brock, but I might just request that we hold it till the discussion process and then we can kind of bring it back up if that's all right.
Yes, sorry about that.
Wonderful. Ellen, next slide, please.
Yep.
Oh, I see one more.
Yeah, Miranda, you want to jump in?
I just have a clarification. If you can go back, when you have the language that says in the near term, identified for near term provision and adopted CIP, I want to clarify, are you saying that is the same as like within the 20-year planning horizon that we're planning for and that housing growth, or are you thinking there's a different timeline associated with near-term provision?
Near-term provision refers to the HPS timeline, so the 6 or 8 year timeline that a housing target is identified for. And near term means producing that infrastructure element or infrastructure investment in time for housing to be produced in this cycle. So you'll see that near term takes the production target window of, let's call it 8 years outside of metro, provides 1 year for the infrastructure installation and 1 year for the housing development itself, which leaves 6 years for that project in a capital plan to come online. Or to break ground, I guess is more accurate.
Are you gonna assume 1 year for each of those things regardless, or will it be dependent on the project?
I think that it's the ability for those capital projects to qualify within the window. If they're unlikely to break ground within 6 years, then they likely cannot be included as projects that would enable development ready land in the inventory in this cycle.
And so it's specifically tied not to the housing needs analysis, which is based on 20 years, but the housing production strategy.
Correct.
Okay.
Thanks, Miranda.
Just one, can I add just one piece to that? And the reason why that connection is made to the HPS is because should a city identify a deficit of development ready lands, the actions they take to remedy that deficit happen in the HPS, not as part of like a housing capacity analysis process. That's why it's tied there.
Yep. 2 more slides and we would get there. The next thing that I want to highlight, and while we're here, I want to define the term encumbered. I noticed I was reminded by a colleague that I had not provided a definition for encumbered. Encumbered has meant a number of different things, but a lot of times encumbered means in a land area that's impacted by natural features like Goal 5 resources, namely wetlands, waterways, elements that likely have some restriction on how the land around them can be used or require buffers, things like that. Encumbrances may not make land undevelopable or unbuildable, but so they're not constraints that are removed in the buildable land inventory, but they might curtail the amount of capacity that land has, or they might require that development happen in specific ways. So I wanted to at least highlight that in the concept of capacity of development ready land. And this is something that we're still working through, very much open to interpretations by the group and sharing of thoughts here. But basically thinking about buildable land inventories assume a capacity based on what zone land is zoned for. So I just provided a quick example of like, we've got an R2 zone that allows 8 to 18 units an acre. That R2 zone has achieved 10 units an acre in other parts of the city. So some places have 18, some have 8, and it averages out to this achieved 10 units an acre. That's what we use for buildable land capacity of that land. If a city has 10 acres of R2, this means that the land has capacity for 100 units. That's how the buildable land inventory classifies or counts that land. There are instances though where maybe that R2 acre that could have 18 units on it has a Goal 5 stream running through it and requires a 25-foot buffer on both sides, and therefore the development of it might have some level of limitation. And the question isn't to assess necessarily how much acreage or how much capacity the land has left, but that the city or jurisdiction doing an inventory might estimate or be able to work through how much of that property is unlikely available in the short term or in the near term. So if there are parcels that are big areas of buildable land, so they're included as vacant or partially vacant on a buildable land inventory, there are steps that that jurisdictions can go through on individual lot basis, but also in large areas to say, we can estimate that 25% of this area is unlikely to be able to support that R2 zone designation. And so we're left with only a portion. We're only left with 75% of that. And so the likelihood of it building out to 18 units an acre, we might be able to manage that or identify where the limitations are on that land so that when someone comes in to develop that property, we already have a set of expectations that both the engineering and public works folks and land use planning folks have evaluated. And I think that's an important step because there are so many examples of where land is identified with capacity that it cannot realize. And we work through it on an individual lot by lot basis. And sometimes that adds to time, which adds to delay and therefore cost. And sometimes there aren't, developers have a hard time carrying both those delays and the costs associated. If we could move to the next slide, please. So I thought there'd be some value in doing a quick comparison. So I showed you those two maps earlier and thought about how does development ready land compare to buildable land. And again, we'll put that just quickly, put that map comparison back up. If you go to the next slide. When a city or a jurisdiction that's required to do a development ready land inventory does this work, they're going to compare both their buildable land and their development ready land. And we're hoping that this spurs a conversation in communities, that we ask the question, and to Ann Kelly, your point is very well taken, that a lot of the prioritization of infrastructure investments is couched in dealing with safety concerns, operational concerns. We want to make sure the water turns on when we turn on our faucet and that when we flush, it goes away. These are very, very important things. And though there just is not enough capital in the system at this very moment to resolve everything and all needs all at once. So we do a lot of prioritization. We're hoping, though, to highlight here that a deficiency of development ready land means that a city or a jurisdiction that does that inventory takes actions that could increase the availability of more land that could be development ready. So that could be infrastructure investment, and or it might look at increasing the capacity of existing development ready land, which might translate to something called a land use efficiency measure. And it is exactly what it says, that more housing could be accommodated on land that is available, that is development ready. And with that, I'll move into some of our final questions. I just want to leave a little bit of space here. What are the remedies? So we talked a little bit about demonstrably preparing land for development readiness. These are housing production strategies. And I wanted to leave a little bit of space for thinking about the text in attachment A of proposed rule language, if anyone has comments, and then we'll move into a series of conversations. Please, Brad.
Yes, sorry. So looking at the memo and the attachment for this one, in the memo, this is on the bottom of page 4, says development ready land inventory, blah, blah, blah. Acres identified as development ready will be cataloged by zone, assumed to have capacity of the achieved densities. Areas with constraint, natural features, public facilities determined not development ready if they can't reach the minimum density of the zone. But in the rule, and this is the second part, so top of page 7, that 1B sub 2, limited by utility capacity and supporting parcels achieve density. So I just wanted to note the disconnect there. And based on the definition and statute of development ready lands, I think that should be the minimum allowable density. And obviously, if we can get to the achieved density, that's great, right? But it would be development ready just based on its ability to achieve that minimum density. And then another piece, and I don't know if this is like necessarily the perfect spot to put it in, but while I'm on the train of thought, I think there needs to be some sort of, and I don't know that it necessarily has to be in rule, right? But I think that when we're planning all of this in the broader sense, there needs to be some sort of consideration of, okay, if the achieved density here, right, allowed is like 8 to 18, if the achieved is 10, right, and that wouldn't be, currently there's, infrastructure capacity that would only allow for up to 8 to be developed, right, on the low end. what is the cost of upgrading the infrastructure to add those additional units, and how is that being spread out, right? Because it might make more sense to just say, hey, you know, we were initially hoping that this would be about 10, right? We realize it's not going to get there. Let's let it build at 8. And if there's another spot where we can add 10, or maybe it's, you know, less costly per unit to add or to upgrade infrastructure to another site, then it might be economically more beneficial to just allow it to develop to the minimum and know that the higher density is going to go in elsewhere in your development regulations.
Thank you for identifying that omission and the consistency. That was a correction that I hoped to make prior to putting the packet out. Thank you. And secondly, yes, to your point, there's a very substantial debate about how to characterize properties that can only achieve that minimum density. Thank you for highlighting it.
Yep, Miranda?
Yeah, I actually have a question on the not encumbered portion, but I will kind of add on to that discussion slightly, which is to highlight that especially in the metro area, we have a minimum density that's based on a maximum density, so that will always have to be like the baseline for us. And then I would assume that when you're looking at like what has been produced on average in a zone, if the zoning has changed over time to modify the range of density, then are we able to essentially subtract out like the areas that were developed to that zone prior to the modification in density? Because we wouldn't want those prior developments essentially to lower the average, knowing that we're going to essentially produce higher moving forward. Okay, I'm saying a head nod yes, so great.
And I think that gets back to some of the rules related to housing capacity analysis because it's embedded in BLI.
Yeah.
So I think what you'll find is that when you initiate a new BLI, the achieved density of the zone will likely take into account that you've made an efficiency measure change. And
yeah.
therefore you're not only are you achieving higher densities, but you likely will achieve even higher densities based on the adjustment.
Great. Okay, so to the question I had about not encumbered, or maybe it's a statement, I'm not sure, somewhere in between, but I noticed that it talks about like local, state, or federal regulations that would encumber the land. And so I guess I would advocate for ask if it's intended to incorporate things related to wetlands for DSL, or that might require DSL or DEQ permits. And I guess advocate that we subtract that out in terms of the definition and not in terms of like how it applies to the land. And the way I'm going to explain this is like we essentially implement all of that through our goal 5, which for Wilsonville would be significant resource overlay zone. So all of that's incorporated in terms of the concept planning, the master planning, when it comes in. But the way I read this definition is it can't be encumbered, meaning it can't kind of have that designation, or it has entitlements. And so the concern I have is that the permitting process through DSL and DEQ takes a very long time and doesn't happen until the land is actually annexed and under development and going through development review, meaning there would be absolutely no way for us to count that land as buildable, even though or development ready, even though it is development ready, because they won't actually process those permits and provide that entitlement until it's going through the development process. So I would just like to say that, like, I think there's some nuance there that the locals have control over being able to bring it in and have the land develop. And that there's these state requirements that would look like it's encumbering and not entitled, but it follows the local process. So I would just advocate that we're attentive to that and make sure that those things aren't standing in the way because the land is development ready.
Thanks for raising that, Miranda. I don't have anything to add or rejoin with, but you make a good point.
Yep, thanks, Miranda. It's Mary Kyle and then Anita, and then I do want to make, we have a few more questions that we want to get through the next little bit. Mary Kyle? Oh, Mac, I see.
Yeah, I think Miranda talked about the nuance needed in the encumbering, and I'm hoping with this discussion is still open because there are areas where you can cluster development. You might have that 25-foot setback, but you can still achieve the minimum density or some aspect of the density because there's a clustering or a transfer of development rights, or it's still the remaining property is still zoned fairly high. So there's some nuance there that I think some of the language seems a little bit more absolute sounding, like you just don't get to count it at all. And so I just don't have solutions yet, but I just think there's more nuance there that we need to continue to think through, or at least have the opportunity for cities to say why, to justify why a particular piece of land should still be counted as development ready, even though it might have this resource overlay over it.
Yeah, thanks, Mary Kyle. Anita?
This is a comment or clarifying question from Corey. Is agency viewing zone for residential use, in quotes, the same as, quotes, zoned to allow for residential use? So Corey, maybe you can clarify what your question is there about that nuance.
Yeah, sure. Happy to. So I think in our most recent CowTac conversation, we were looking at definitions of partially vacant land and had a really good discussion about this very kind of like nuanced issue. And so I'm just curious in this context, how the agency is viewing this. Is it zoned for residential use? And does that actually mean that it's zoned to allow for residential use? Because we've had a lot of state legislative action that's really, made residential development possible on all kinds of different zoning. So that's what the question's about. Thanks.
I think we started from a place of zone to allow, because that's often the role that cities have played, particularly in capacity analysis context that you're alluding to. In the context of development readiness, though, I think we're hoping to move more into a paradigm, because development readiness will inform HPS actions, that not only will a city zone to allow for things, but they'll also begin incentivizing and making more likely some of the outcomes that they've zoned for. And that's, I think, the intent. Colleagues that are on the call, please correct me if I'm misstating this, but that it's our intent that housing production strategies have an effort that goes beyond laying the zoning opportunities to setting the table, but rather like adding a snack, an opportunity for something to materialize, not just as the minimum density that is zoned, but rather to incentivize achieving more with that property. And I see, Celestina, you've got your hand up, so please jump in if you feel.
Sure. Thanks, Maddie. Corey, was your question about like the CowTac conversation around lands that maybe are commercially zoned but allow residential even if it's not a formal residential zone? Or was it more what Maddie was just talking about in terms of actions you might take?
I think it's more what you just described, right? Of just acknowledging that when we're talking about what land is development ready for housing, right? Like this seems pretty narrow, right? That it's about what is zoned residential, but in actuality, there may be things like a commercial site or a parking lot or something like this that has adjacent infrastructure that hits some of these other criteria, and yet it seemed like it might be excluded from this definition. And so I think that's just what I'm seeking is clarity there. Thanks, Celestina.
Yeah, no problem. Over back to you, Maddie, and that question about sort of what is the scope of actions we might take. Maybe we'll put a pin in.
Yeah.
Sure. Corey, great question, especially in the context of commercial land that has opportunity for residential. I think there are certainly some ways that we'll see jurisdictions doing this inventory take into consideration the capacity that those lands hold and think about something that's different from achieved density. I don't know if we've landed exactly on what that outcome looks like, but you raise an excellent point that there is capacity in land that is not necessarily outright residential, but rather allows outright residential use on land that's zoned otherwise. So thank you for raising that, and we'll be sure to address it in the next iteration.
That's great. So we're gonna go to Mac. Before you start, Mac, why don't we just flip the slides? Because we're starting to get into the conversation around statutory intent and kind of how the rules relate to it. So we're gonna have this, hopefully folks can see the slides, start thinking about the questions. Mac, help us out. And then Maddie, if you want to add any context to what we're asking.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. And I guess I can ask, or I want to kind of ask, I have some feedback about it was a couple slides ago talking about like what are the things that'd be helpful for sort of near-term investment in housing. I'm happy to touch on that. If it makes sense to talk about that later, I can defer that comment. So just let me know.
Just jump in, Mac.
Okay. Yeah, so one of the things that I'm thinking about, and partly I think a definition of near term in my world is different than the intent of near term here, but one of the things I'm really thinking about in that context is about process and clear communication of expectations and standards for developers when looking at sites and coming up with development proposals. I'm going to touch again on the example that I'd given previously about we looked at the land use decision of when a lot was divided, made assumptions based off of that, including a budget, timeline, etc., and then went to the early assistance meeting. In that meeting, we didn't get to find out all of the information that we got to find out later in formal land use once engineering was more engaged. I want to contrast that experience of when I have worked with the city of Portland. The city of Portland in those early assistance meetings brings in everyone, brings in all of the different bureaus, including different state agencies if they need to intersect. And in that meeting, I get like bombarded, admittedly, with a bunch of information, but that way I have all the information of how the local code and different requirements from utility or special districts or whatever intersect specifically with the site that maybe my architect couldn't just tell just from reading code. And I think one of a best practice to kind of institute in a process moving forward, especially for some of those medium to larger size jurisdictions where you can't just pick up the phone and call planning and engineering really quickly to like quickly get an answer, is making sure that all of those different agencies, whether internal city departments or external, are there at the table early on and very clear about their standards. One of the things that really could have helped us in that example that I gave originally is if we had had offhandedly that that only gravity lines would be allowed for sewer and stormwater. If we knew that early on, we would have baked that into the design. We would have baked that into our construction timeline and not have to play a constant game of catch up later. That was sort of putting the project constantly at risk and all the investment out of pocket that we had made also at risk from our organization. And so getting to have those decision makers from whether it's like in this example, which was in Washington County, like Clean Water Services, other sorts of folks who are going to be doing that review at the table earlier on to provide that clarity can really help to make sure that as a developer is bringing forward a proposal and investing and trying to find the funding in our context, at least, that we know all that information and can plan accordingly. And so I just wanted to touch on that, and that can really help make sure that projects, that are ready and think they can really move forward and not have to deal with these last minute sort of hurdles thrown in on them.
Yeah, Mac, you make great points about being able to incorporate that information into your pro forma before you go ask the bank for a loan, among other things. And then you also speak to an item, this idea of pre-application being an opportunity for clearing house for all of the information that's required on the development and bringing everyone in early. That one-stop experience really helps. In my experience, to clarify what expectations are and what challenges are available. That you don't have to have solutions to everything, but you have to at least know what they are.
Yeah.
And I think that it gets to another question that we'll have after this, if we have time, is thinking about what conversations we hope that this development ready land inventory spurs in the community. Like what we make a map and we show these things on it, but what conversation ensues after that, and what does it help streamline in the process? So thank you for sharing that.
Thank you.
Thank you. And you had come off mute earlier. Were you going to add something?
Oh, I'm not sure when the appropriate time is. I did appreciate hearing that, Mac. Thank you. We did require front end work with Clean Water Services for middle housing to avoid that problem. But we do need to think about it for other types of development as well, and we are. My concern is mostly related to timing assumptions as part of all of this work, and it also ties back to last meeting's discussion about kind of midterm assessment of how your proposed actions are working and potential to revise those at that time. I'm thinking that, we're in this really uncertain economic environment right now. It's very difficult for developers to develop or to feel secure about it right now. It's hard to make assumptions that they'll be, really gung-ho in this very short period. I mean, 6 years in a development scenario is a kind of a short time. And to think that we can, first of all, assume like, let's take, for example, a year to get public improvements built. That's a very short window when I think about public improvements that I've experienced since 1998 in the county. And then following that, so maybe the land is not counting the county's review time for that, there's also all of the work that the applicant or the developer has to do toward preparing an application, and then toward getting information that meets requirements. And, they take as long as they need at their end while they're trying to complete those requirements. And then they get an approval. It has conditions for public improvements. Typically takes about 2 years to see them meet those conditions and build those improvements before they can even get permits to build housing. I'm talking about a subdivision, but this could apply to a development as well. So I'm just seeing a lot of assumptions of timing that are really they're just not very realistic to me. So we're thinking about calling things development ready, I think, with very optimistic timelines. And then we're talking about looking, for us, it would be 3 years into our work, we'd be looking at, are these actions that we've proposed working in our housing production strategy? Well, there's really no way that we would be seeing significant results 3 years in from this. So I think this is a bigger question related to the many variables that we're discussing in terms of development ready lands, in terms of when our production strategies, are test worthy. I want to put it out there that this timing question, I think Brian brought it up earlier. This timing question is really a big one. And I think the environment we're in economically is going to make it a bigger one than we've seen before. So
I agree. I'm nodding my head like a bobblehead.
David, thank you. Let's go to you, Brock. And I wonder, Maddie, I know we only have a few minutes left kind of in this topic. I wonder if we skip to a couple more slides around kind of the, what actions jurisdictions can take to likely to increase. And maybe Ann just gets to a little bit of kind of what actions within a timeline that demonstrably demonstrate kind of question. But Brock, jump in.
Yeah. And I think to Ann's point, that I'll just tag on to, I think that's kind of, and Maddie, correct me if I'm wrong, I'm guessing that's kind of what your intent was with breaking it into kind of those 3 categories of like, one is like, it's ready now, and the other is, yeah, okay. Thank you. The other piece that I was going to say, more in relation to the question about statutory intent. Bottom of page 7, so we have that subsection 3. Jurisdiction may adopt their DRL inventory with the BLI, or it can be included in submittals for the HPS. I know the inventory has to be conducted at the same time as the BLI based on statute. I'm not sure if there's a justifiable reason to delay adopting your DRL inventory until the HPS as opposed to doing it with the BLI. It seems to me that those should both happen at the same time. So yeah, I guess I'll leave it at that.
I can speak to that briefly, Brock, but you raise a good point that the development ready land inventory is identified to be done at the same time as a BLI because of the efficiency that's presented. You're doing the vacant and partially vacant analysis, and from an economy of scale perspective of GIS, it makes a lot of sense. However, the development ready land inventory is not a consideration or component of determining sufficient capacity of the urban growth boundary. And so by adopting it in, it's sort of like does it give a community the tools or imperative that it's looking for? So if it adopts with a buildable land inventory through a capacity analysis, then there might be some risk. They might be subject to some appeal risk or opportunities to rebut that work that might hold up the HCA. And so the opportunity here is to submit it with HPS work so that it's clear, one, that it informs production strategies and actions and not the growth boundary question. And then secondly, that that it's not subject to that, it's not likely to be an impediment to adoption of the HCA.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
So there's some, it's sort of like there are some communities that adopt these pieces separate or sequentially, others that choose to lump them together because there's not a likely risk to any one piece of them slowing down the roll.
Yeah, and I guess and I appreciate that explanation. I'm just trying to kind of think around the standpoint of like someone appealing a development ready land inventory. Because as far as like, okay, something's not quite development ready, but then it is a housing production strategy action to prepare that land for development, right? And I don't think that part needs to be done with the BLI. I think that can be done in the HPS, which would come after your HCA, but like that is what exists now, right? And so I think they should be able to say, and cities, please correct me if you think I'm saying something that's incorrect, but just like, hey, here's our buildable lands inventory, here's our development ready lands inventory. Based on that, this is what our capacity is, and if we want to do some more efficiency measures to try to increase that capacity, right now that's a housing production strategy action.
That's all within the realm of production strategies and thinking about how a city moves forward. So just to offer a couple ideas to give you a sense of what our infrastructure subcommittee talked about. There were lots of votes we did some brainstorming. We thought about refinement planning and area planning that's typical of areas that are vacant or partially vacant that might have development potential. There were a series of other considerations that might do some work to refine, particularly infrastructure that might serve key properties, like for enabling annexation to be a little bit easier for some properties. So doing that work in advance of inquiry, as maybe Anne and others have alluded, sometimes that takes a long time. And so thinking about ways to cut down the process time or the evaluation, the assessment time by other departments within the city, and similar activities that advance each step of this. So maybe it's taking the water line that's going to serve a whole new area of opportunity, or perhaps even upsizing a line that's inside a city to enable more housing choice in a neighborhood. These are both things that cities or special districts that do this work can advance those efforts of design so that when interest arises or comes to the counter, it's not a surprise and it doesn't put the community or the district on its heels. So to your point, Brock, having that material available and adopted or acknowledged in some formal capacity is very valuable. And it may be that a city wants to go through even a resolution process that says we've done this development ready land inventory and we want to use it to make some investment decisions. Those are all on the table and open for consideration. I think where we're just concerned is requiring it to go with any one particular vehicle may constrain its utility.
Thank you.
All right, thank you. So I did just throw, I know I'm putting a bunch of different questions into the chat, but so in our last several minutes of this kind of topic area, I just want to offer kind of an open platform for folks to jump in wherever it might make sense. Shannon?
Yeah, thanks. And just a very broad comment, like, wow, is this important, right? Like, wow, is this important? And this whole conversation and the nature of this conversation, I just feel like it's really pivotal. So I just wanted to say, like, thank you for all of the work done on this so far. And the next thing that I'm thinking, I keep going back to like the middle income revolving loan fund, for example, and we have hopes, hearing on Friday at 1 p.m. Here's my commercial for some infrastructure funding that cities get access, right? And I think where I'm headed here is like, and I think this is what I'm hearing. So maybe I'm just trying to echo it back and make sure this is right, that we're encouraging cities to think about what everything is that's in their power to help some of these parcels actually result in needed housing. I mean, is that the fair summary?
I'm seeing heads shaking. Yes, everything in their power. Yep.
Yeah, in specific, Shannon, everything that removes barriers to potentially enabling certain residential development that's needed. So whatever is contextually identified as a need for a community, hopefully informs when you put the development ready land inventory next to that contextualized housing need, are there areas that synchronize or light up? Are there investments that could really enable the production of certain kinds of housing in certain areas that it's needed, for certain income level groups or certain types of housing? And those are considerations that I think what you'll see, and I agree, your assessment of the way that the language is crafted is very optimistic, that we're hoping that cities and jurisdictions that do this work, that they'll have a lot of latitude to include things, even though the circumstances might be uncertain, but at least taking the steps that are within your power as a jurisdiction that provides those utility elements to think about what it would take to do them, rather than waiting for individual interests to knock on the door and prompt that work internally. So I hear what you're saying, both Anne and Shannon, that there's like a multitude, a lot of different things that could be done to support production of housing in different capacities and ways. And I think there's also a recognition that this is going to be a fairly significant challenge, given that our system is not really oriented in this way yet.
Yeah, Shannon, follow up.
Yeah, if I could do a follow up, I feel like I want to say sometimes it has been, right? Like if there's a specific like redevelopment district, right? I think we have seen cities do this, right? Where they say, we're going to invest in this like corridor right here. Who wants to come to the table to have like, let's seek community engagement. And then let's like advertise this essentially to various developers of kinds of needed structures, which might be multifamily or mixed use. I think I have seen that happen. It's just like the tiniest of pushbacks, but I don't know that it seems like it's a little too special.
Thank you, Shannon. So let's go Brian and Kassira.
Yeah, just really quick. This is, so I've had the fortune of working very closely with my counterparts in engineering. So in the city of Bend, we do a bunch of multidisciplinary work. And so what I'm going to describe here is kind of the process we've used, because we have been hyper-focused in the recognition that planning is all great and groovy, right? But it doesn't mean much unless you have the infrastructure. So the planning is relatively straightforward. If this is all straightforward, it's relatively straightforward compared to the provision of infrastructure, which is tremendously expensive and complex. But I think my comments here around controlling our expectations a bit, right? Because the typical process in Oregon to meet multiple state laws, including goals 9, 10, and 11, is, you do your land planning and then you do your public facility planning, right? So you have to have public facility plans, PFPs, that match your land use. So those PFPs, you have water, sewer, transportation, stormwater. Each one of those plans to update those can take years and millions of dollars. And then once you have those 20-year plans, then you have to look at your rate structures to see how you're going to fund this. So this process that we're talking about is so wonderful because it's going to expose that, wow, we have land and our urban growth boundaries are outside. Wow, we can't serve it very quickly. But the remedy to this, it's foreshadowing. The remedy is in increasing utility rates. Increasing utility rates is very politically unpopular. Increasing SDCs, system development charges, very unpopular. Typically, you have builders and realtors that are fighting the SDC increases. No disrespect, but just my history here, what I've experienced. And no one likes to pay more for their water and sewer bills. And paying more for water and sewer bills also hits people at lower income levels disproportionately harder. And so there is a real tension here in our ability to pay for all of this. And this is all in the context of the state of Oregon forcing more planning upon cities, and it's all good stuff, right? But we're not talking about how we're funding public infrastructure at scale to meet the housing need across this state. And that is the real one. That's the real one to tackle. And cities need help because ratepayers are not going to bear all these costs.
Ryan, I think you're hitting that third question that's in the chat around the conversation that you're hoping really results from this type of discussion and to have that real what's real long-term reality there.
It'll be measured over years, folks. This is years of grappling with an issue that I think practitioners know all too well based on all these stories. But the remedies are very complex and they take a lot of time to figure out.
Yeah, thanks for naming us. So let's go Ann and then Sarah, and then we're gonna have to pivot, unfortunately. It's been a wonderful conversation. We'll take a break after the comments. Ann?
I just wanted to be more clear about my prior statement. Madeline, I appreciate you speaking to that. My concern about timing is not just about what cities or counties do. There is a lot that falls on the developer, and a lot of that comes down to funding and availability of workers and timing that developers can get those people on board. For example, in 2008, when we had an economic downturn, we extended our 2-year preliminary subdivision approval to 5 years because developers were having so much trouble gathering the funding and the wherewithal to do the building. And a lot of those expired after 5 years without any action. So it's not just about cities and counties doing everything they can to improve their own processes. We are doing all kinds of things, and we're very optimistic about what we hope to do to facilitate housing. We have 3 projects going with DLCD, another in-house project working on a large overhaul, 2 of them to facilitate housing. But it's not all on the jurisdiction. The timing is largely outside of us in the development community. So I just want to be real clear about that. Thanks.
Thanks, Ann. Sarah?
Great.
I'll try not to keep us from our break here, but wanted to kind of jump back to what Brian was talking about and maybe set aside the funding piece. But I would love to see this process result in, evaluation criteria of capital projects. I think we've talked about this a bit in the CowTech, but how can development ready lands be used to kind of filter potential projects and maybe prioritize those that would then either increase the amount of development ready land or make sure that lands in the development ready land inventory are primed and ready to go. Essentially the city or county is doing everything that they can do. I agree with you, Anne. A lot of it is up to the property owner or developer. But I think there's a really big opportunity here for just feedback loops, even doing kind of a look back when you're updating your next development ready lands inventory. Okay, these are the lands that didn't develop in the 6 or 8 year cycle. Do we know why? Or, can we maybe invest in some areas that are, maybe adjacent to help them add to the development ready lands inventory? So, and then as the special district, I think another feedback loop is just making sure that cities, counties, special districts are all in communication to make sure that everyone's on the same page, that as we develop our own public facility plans, that, I think that it's been touched on before, but, we have areas that align that regional and local infrastructure are going to be available. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you. Well, Maddie, do you want to close this out and then send us to break?
Yep. Last thought. Thank you for everyone who shared or even just followed along in thinking through this new concept that we're translating into rule from legislation. I think the big takeaways are coordination and creativity, thinking about how can cities and counties, jurisdictions that are responsible for doing an inventory, how can they better or encourage a conversation around coordination. And secondly, think through creative ways to meet their housing production targets, given this shorter window of consideration. So thank you for sharing your thoughts. If you have other thoughts you want to share, there's always the follow-up survey after the RAC meeting. And just a huge amount of appreciation for the reading through the materials and listening along and sharing your thoughts.
Awesome. Thanks, Maddie. So, and I see your comment in the chat. I'll just lift it up and just acknowledge the kind of broader context across the state for local jurisdictions that are struggling with budgeting, experiencing layoffs, right? So this need for state funding and additional kind of dollars coming in that can't necessarily be seen at the local level. And I think overlaid with what Brian named as well as, how do you actually raise the dollars in an environment that, any type of tax or fee or kind of system charge is politically unpalatable. So thanks for naming that. Okay, so it's 11:12. Let's take 10 minutes. Celestina, Thea, we're stealing a couple minutes from y'all. So just, you'll plan accordingly for your update. Maddie, thank you. Thank you, everybody. That was an awesome conversation. Let's come back at 11:22. Thanks. Thank you, Ingrid. Welcome back, folks. 10 minutes goes faster and faster every time. So Thea and Celestina, you're going to provide an update to the group. So I'll just have you dive right in.
Alrighty, thank you so much, Ben. I will start us off today and then hand over to Thea in a bit here. So just brief review here about the Housing Actions Work Group. It kicked off in December 2024 after updated charge from the Land Conservation and Development Commission. We started working in the spring, even though the RAC wasn't meeting because of some pretty condensed timelines and a large scope. And we're looking toward a milestone of having some draft deliverables, draft rule concepts and things like that by the end of the biennium. And of course, we have the rule adoption in December of this year for any and all of the remaining rules for the Oregon Housing Needs Analysis rulemaking. So with that, let's get into a little bit more of the substance. This is a review of our HOG policy objectives. These were developed to help guide the specific work of the Housing Actions Work Group. They are echoed throughout, the statutory language that guides the Oregon Housing Needs Analysis generally, as well as the commission direction in terms of priorities, but just establishes a little bit of a narrower focus specifically for the Housing Actions Work Group. So that includes diversity of housing, ensuring that we have homes in high opportunity areas that increase housing choice, streamlining housing development processes, and increasing community capacity and resilience. So that's the lens that we're using as we're working with the Housing Actions Work Group. And on the next slide, we'll do another sort of reorientation to goal 10 and then highlights of where in this process the Housing Actions Work Group has really been focusing. So this is the same graphic that Maddie used earlier to name specifically sort of that top center area of Goal 10 work, the housing capacity analysis, including the development ready lands inventory. And while there are connections, and we started exploring a few of those earlier today, the Housing Actions Work Group is largely focused on some of the other parts of this process, the contextualized housing need, the housing production strategy, selecting actions in there, and the housing acceleration program. So let's click through the slides here. The next few are sort of highlighting slides. Yes, I should have clicked through for that, that demonstration. Yes, there we go. So contextualized housing need is in that determining what the local housing need is, the action selection and the housing production strategy, and then acceleration program to identify what additional actions could be taken to reduce persistent barriers. And then we've got one more slide here just to really distill down for this sort of thread of the work that those are the three pieces that we're working with. So to take a closer look at the first one, the contextualized housing need, we wanted to present the framework that the HOG has started to work with about how a compliance pathway might be developed through doing this work. So that's the scope of the Housing Actions Work Group primarily, is to say we adopted these base rules in December of 2024 about how a local government needs to identify their housing need contextually and select housing production actions. And there's a lot of discretion for how local governments do that within those rules. And what would it look like to create a more defined and in some ways predetermined step-by-step for completing this work. So that's the compliance. When we say compliance pathway, that's what we mean. Something closer to a checklist or predetermined path. So with that, on the next slide, we can look at the way the Housing Actions Work Group has been discussing that so far, or most recently, actually, because we've tried to explore just about any option that we can think up as a project team about how this type of work might be approached, because it's a little bit of a tough nut to crack to take a statewide program that's inherently working with localized environments and create a little bit more standardization. So we've looked at a lot of ways to try and crack that nut. And the one that the Housing Actions Work Group has been discussing most recently is thinking that really only a portion of the contextualized housing needs work could be supported by a more standardized compliance pathway. And that might be some key needs, whereas all other needs, all other kinds of housing needs that maybe are even more localized or even more contextual, or we have data environment that isn't quite as supportive of standardization, still need to be identified, and they're identified locally rather than through a more statewide compliance pathway. So some of the key needs in play, are housing type mix, accessibility and adaptability of housing, for example, and housing in high opportunity areas that increase housing choice, as we saw on the HOG policy objectives, just to sort of give you a flavor of some of the key needs. whereas all other needs that again might be much more context specific, although really all of the needs can be. So I don't mean to say that none of the housing needs are context specific, but ones where we have less data, like maybe locally specific, culturally relevant features of housing. That might be something that is still important and needed locally, but is more challenging to standardize statewide. So identifying something like that would still be subject to the base rules. So we've heard some initial thoughts and grapplings on this topic, and on the next slide we have a highlight of some of those. We've heard that the contextualized housing need should, we've largely heard that the contextualized housing need should reflect sort of actual need as accurately as possible, trying to find data sources that really demonstrate this is how much we have this need. And not quite going to that next step of assessing feasibility of meeting that need, saying how, how as a local government can we possibly produce all of the housing that's specifically, accessible. That seems like a tall order because we need a lot, but still naming the need and then going to the actions and knowing that the actions are going to sort of carry that feasibility piece. That of course, local government is required to only do what's in their control. And even if the need is something that the local government can't absolutely guarantee happens, still setting the conditions and doing what's in a local government's control to do that is part of the actions work. So needs, identifying need as clearly as possible. Actions, doing as much as we can. We've heard interest in cross-goal alignment. So that's one of the examples of that is transportation and housing planning rules. There's even, as we just heard earlier today, some Goal 5 resources and housing overlap as well. So this really is something we're trying to hold throughout the rulemaking and comes up in the Housing Actions Work Group as well. Interest in simplicity as much as possible while ensuring flexibility. This is one I know that we all aspire to and will continue to return to as a North Star because it's challenging in practice, but is definitely ideal. And then some ideas about maybe inverting sort of this compliance pathway model where we've been largely discussing, well, how could a local government take these steps, identify need or select actions in the case of the HPS, which we'll get to next. And what would it look like specifically for identifying need, I think is where we've heard this the most, to say, well, we know that this way of identifying need maybe is not representative, or a local government can't or should not do it that way, but the realm of what is possible for other ways to come to this conclusion remains open. So regulating what a local government cannot do rather than more specificity on what it may, should, or must do. So that's another idea that's on the table that we've recently explored or begun exploring a little bit more. And with that, we have some follow-up questions that are remaining on the table for identifying housing need in a more structured way, which are, which of the 4 compliance tools works best for the contextualized housing need? So this is about saying, what if if we're going to proceed with this key needs approach, saying, all local governments need to be assessing these key needs in a particular way. Is that under the context of a safe harbor where something like that would be optional, but would ensure compliance? Is that in the context of a rebuttable presumption, more of a should or must unless rebutted? So a local government must use this path unless it's demonstrated that something else is actually meeting the goals better. Or a minimum standard is another option to say a local government must do at least this, but identifying maybe more need in addition to this would also be okay. Or regulatory requirement to say local government must identify this need exactly. No above or below, it's just exactly this. So that's a review of this compliance pathway frame that we're working in the Housing Actions Work Group, and you'll see those compliance tools reiterated in the other sections of the work as well. So hopefully that characterization of them will help when Thea mentions that we have a similar question for some of the other work in the HOG. And then the second piece is really getting at the line between sort of key needs and these other needs that are really tougher to create a standardized approach to. So where do we draw the line between a need that as a state we feel we can make some more standardized evaluations about versus those where we think that really the need should truly best be identified and described locally, and how do we name that in a discrete way if we can, and if we can't, then just grappling with the hog sort of one by one. This is potentially a key need, and this might be how we identify it. And with that, let's see, I've got a distracting pop-up box on my screen, but yes, that is the conclusion of our overview for the piece of the HOG work for identifying local needs. And I'll hand it over to Thea to talk about taking action to meet those needs.
Thank you, Celestina. And here we are again, just to locate us in the process. Now we're moving into the housing production strategy. So once a jurisdiction has established its need through the CHN, either through a compliance pathway or through the base rules, and determined its capacity, it moves into its housing production strategy era. The output here, as you all know by now, is a plan that responds to the identified needs with a set of actions aimed to support housing production, affordability, and choice in a manner which affirmatively furthers fair housing. And the HOG has discussed a pretty wide range of ways that a compliance pathway could be established in the HPS through different program designs and across all 4 compliance tools that Celestina just mentioned. We can go to the next slide. So the most recent HOG discussion reviewed a proposal idea for a partial or sort of bifurcated pathway with one leg addressing key needs, as Celestina introduced them, with a narrowed focus on land use actions. And the other leg sort of responds to everything else with the base rules as they're currently written. This flow chart attempts to sort of illustrate how that could work. So say the CHN over here identifies a need for multi-unit housing. It's a key need, so that can be addressed through land use actions. So a jurisdiction proceeds along this top path, and depending on the compliance tool chosen, can or must select a series of pre-approved action, and there's some level of choice in how to respond there. If a key need can't be addressed through land use, and other local needs have also been identified, and or a jurisdiction selects other kinds of actions per the base rules as written, and those actions include like financial support, public-private partnerships, education, everything that doesn't, isn't strictly a land use action. Let's go to the next slide. So to just sort of give you an example of what that looks like, we pulled this one out just to illustrate. So sticking with the example of multi-unit housing up here at the top, it's a key need categorized under type. The jurisdiction goes to the second column under action and picks one from this short list, and then it goes to the second row there and picks another from a menu that is called the compliance menu that has already been tagged for sort of a pre-approved actions in order to layer the actions to get to a point where we're fairly confident that it will be impactful. Let's go to the next slide. Just to talk a little bit about some HOG feedback we've had during these recent sessions. There's been some interest in ensuring that the land use focus does not deprioritize other actions. So there's some concern that if we incentivize the land use actions in this way, other actions may be deprioritized, especially here, as we say, as they relate to AFFH. I'll say there's some disagreements regarding which actions should or shouldn't be part of that compliance menu. And various specific items of input about the different actions, including suggesting that one action may be better to address a given need than another. And as we kind of in the grand theme of all of this work, that balance between specificity and broad applicability. So this continues to be a theme that we hear. Let's go to the next slide. So follow-up questions that we have here will sort of this already planned updated guidance around the menu revamp, the existing menu of tools and actions that cities already use to respond to their HPSs. Will a revamp there resolve any concerns that a land use focus in the compliance pathway kind of may deprioritize other actions? So that's one thought. How detailed should the actions be, and what should those specifics be in them? So this is something that we're continuing to pursue, and similar to what Celestine had introduced above, which of the 4 compliance tools works best for the HPS, safe harbors, rebuttable presumptions, minimum standards, or regulatory requirements. This is all a part of the conversation that the HUD continues to have. We can go to the next slide. So so this is sort of completing our goal 10 tour today. We really wanted to also spend a little bit of time talking about the Housing Acceleration Program, which we haven't really brought back to the rack since HATAC wrapped up last year. So as just a reminder, a subset of cities or jurisdictions that are falling behind on their production targets may be referred into the acceleration program, which lives here at the end of the process cycle. You can go to the next slide. If and how we actually establish a compliance pathway for the acceleration program is a key decision point. And if and how that pathway intersects with the HPS program is another key decision point. We did want to bring up one item about the way that these different parts of the program are framed. So the HPS is intended to meet housing needs, to address housing needs, while the acceleration program is really designed to identify barriers. And the difference there may be more than semantic. So actions to address needs may not be the same actions you take to address the barriers. Just to have that in your mind as we're going through, we can go to the next slide. So, yeah, sorry. Yeah, but I'll just start talking. I think we're gonna land. Yeah. So one idea that's sort of been floated around about how to integrate a compliance pathway in the acceleration program is to integrate a connection to the compliance menu in the standard audit by way of existing language. So that's what you see up here around prioritization. No need to read the rule language. We just wanted to pull this up to illustrate like the point under the audit, under sub B here, where the audit could point back to the compliance menu that a city would have used if they went through the compliance pathway in the HPS. So completing that circle, This would really have the effect of establishing a level of predictability for jurisdictions and providing kind of a backstop to support prior adoption of the actions during the HPS phase, because a jurisdiction would know that if they fell behind, they might end up there anyway. We can go to the next slide now. Yeah, so now we'll get into a little bit of the HOG feedback on themes in the acceleration program. Definitely interest in seeing a more standardized process developed in this part of the program. And also a suggestion that the standard audit versus the comprehensive audit would be an appropriate vehicle for a more prescriptive compliance pathway. So the comprehensive audit is specifically designed to sort of unearth very localized barriers, particularly around fair housing issues. We can go to the next slide. So because this pathway is kind of less developed, there are a lot of questions that we're grappling with here. And I'll sort of run through these as a bunch of text. Are there any reasons not to add actions in the compliance menu as priorities in the acceleration program in rule? So would this sufficiently link the HPS and acceleration program expectations? If established, should a compliance pathway through the acceleration program be designed to respond directly to the HPS compliance pathway? Effectively, and if done correctly, this might actually have the effect of precluding eligibility for acceleration. So is that good or bad? Is that what we want? And could there be unintended consequences here? Alternatively, would it make sense to establish a sort of more standalone compliance pathway in the acceleration program that's designed to operate independently from the HPS action selection? And could there be unintended consequences to this? I think that wraps up our whirlwind tour of everything that the HOG has been talking about. Not even everything, I'll tell you more later. We can go to the next slide and I'll talk through some of the next steps. So we're gonna continue with HOG meetings. They're sort of regularly scheduled through June, and then we'll probably continue at a slightly different cadence and up until the end of the calendar year. There will be some subject matter experts, small groups we're convening to really drill down on specific issues, a series of focus groups throughout May, and the DLCD Housing Open Fora, which are every other month, and everyone is welcome to. Continued tribal coordination and consultation throughout the various stages of this rule writing. And also just a note that we will be coming back to you in the next draft meeting to review adoption ready actions, which is sort of the other leg of the work that the HOG has been talking about and staff and consultants are developing. So I think that wraps up everything that we needed to get through and quickly. So I hand it back to you, Ben. Thank you.
Right, thank you. So I think we have a few minutes if there's any clarifying questions for Celestina and Thea. Okay, you were so thorough. It seems as if folks don't have questions. So I appreciate that. Thank you for the update. Ethan?
Moving into next steps here, Ben.
Yeah.
What I hear? Okay, awesome. So yeah, we talked a little bit in the conclusion of Celestina and Thea's presentation there that next Rulemaking Advisory Committee meeting will touch on adoption ready actions, but also come back to some of these conversations that the Capacity and Urbanization Technical Advisory Committee has been having in the interim. And I also wanted to kind of highlight here that when we think about this work in up until June 2025, there will be a time in which, for the state's purposes, we change from one biennium to the next biennium. And with the renewal of a new state budgetary biennial cycle, we'll have more information to share with you in terms of the next steps for the Rulemaking Advisory Committee, in terms of the meetings and the cadence and all of those kind of things, and some of the technical advisory committees as well. So I just want to kind of put that out there for folks to just be aware of, that you'll soon hear more information about what's going to happen in the latter part of the year. But in terms of things that we do know now, is that we will be taking these rules that you all will help us continue to craft throughout 2025 to the Land Conservation and Development Commission for their public hearing in October, and then for adoption hearing in early December 5th and 4th and 5th, I believe is the date. It's a Thursday, Friday, the first week of December. So those are kind of like the big milestones on the horizon, and things to be aware of. But I appreciate the conversation that you all helped us have today, particularly around the urbanization work, because I know some of that is a little bit more tricky and is particularly technical in nature. So I appreciate that discussion and look forward to having that more and more throughout the rest of the time with you all here in 2025. But Mary Kyle?
Thanks, Ethan. There was a lot of stuff you just said. So I just wanted to back up from that first hearing date in October for the HOG, right? And the something else.
All rules.
All
of
rules,
the
right? All the
2025.
remaining rules.
Yes.
So
yes.
I'm sorry if you said this, but when do you think, when is your target date to have a really discussion-ready full set of rules for us to chew on?
Sure. Yeah, it's a good question.
I know we've been doing it throughout, but yeah.
Yeah, I am for sure by August, September time period. We'll have bits and pieces probably to share with you, June, July, early August. But when we think about kind of the timeline of the rulemaking process, the big milestone to make sure that we kind of queue up those October and December meetings with LCDC is October 1st of 2025. That is where the entirety of the package is going to the Secretary of State for public notice, but we'll have drafts in advance of that for discussion with the Rulemaking Advisory Committee. And that's kind of like this, I don't know, it's very similar to the Rulemaking Advisory Committee process, but it is somewhat external. It's for like the Secretary of State rulemaking and public notice process.
And I know we've been having this pretty fast cadence here between the RAC and the tax, and then you all have to have some time to just yourselves without all of us to digest it all, right? And put it all together. So that sounds like June or July is when we might see something or maybe July, August, that we closer to the final thing that you'll be putting into the Secretary of State on October 1st.
Well, yeah, it won't be we won't surprise folks with the first draft on October
1st, right? Okay.
Yeah, right. We'll have an opportunity to, share some of those drafts with, notes and policy objectives and what the intent is, all of that kind of stuff in advance of that.
Thanks.
And thanks, Mary Kyle. And I, just harkening back to some of the previous conversations and asks, right? Just DLCD, y'all's willingness to share, what I'll say, share in rough draft, to the extent that folks are getting eyes on things, early, often, and continuously. I think that's been kind of said out loud. And then Celestina, you had maybe a more specific kind of target for the HOG. Do you want to speak to that?
Yeah, absolutely. So last year, we had a similar experience with the scope of rules, and we had slated June as the sort of rule writing month and pause on meetings for both the housing accountability and the needs and production scope, and then came back in July with that, the conversation shifted to those drafts, and I think maybe that's what you're asking about, Mary Kyle. I know for sure Thea and I have slated this year July as the rule writing month instead of June. And so we would be looking at August for when we have, these capital D sort of drafts in rule language to start picking at in a little finer tuned way. So I can speak to that particular chunk.
That's great. That's really, exactly what I was hoping for.
Okay.
Thanks.
Awesome. Thank you. Anita, any reflection? Oh, sorry, Ethan.
Sorry, Ben. I just want to kind of follow that all the way to the end. Then we're having conversations about those draft proposals in a series of meetings, continuing even post that October 1st publication through the Secretary of State, continue to have discussions with you all in the technical advisory committees throughout that time period, all the way through the close of the public comment period, which will happen around mid-November. I don't think we've landed on a full date, close date for that quite yet, but all of those conversations with rulemaking advisory committee, with the work groups, with the technical advisory committees can happen all the way up until that public comment period closes.
Awesome. Thank you, Ethan. So Anita, just wanted to create a little bit of space. I feel like there was some engagement around the racial equity framework, kind of concepts. So I just wanted to give you a little space to reflect on what you were hearing today.
Yeah, thanks, Ben. And thanks for the folks on the RAC for discussing some of these issues. I think what I heard in particular was infrastructure investments and displacement. One of them is when does that happen? But what is the impact on the folks who are actually living in those areas? So I know some communities have some anti-displacement strategies, and I know DLCD has some guidance related to that. So I think that's an important component for racial equity. And then I also heard just kind of investments also in infrastructure and the impact on folks for low income as far as utility bills and who's going to pay that. And not only utility bills, but probably just the cost of housing. So I think those are important elements to be thinking about as we're moving forward. And I also see Vice Chair Lazo is there. If you have any other comments that you'd heard that you'd like to kind of re-emphasize as well.
Yeah, thanks, Anita. Thanks, Ben. I appreciate you circling back to that, and I appreciate Shane bringing that up. I think when we're talking about such a technical area, that piece kind of gets lost, right? We tend to dive right into the details of how do we make this thing work? What are the dials we're turning, without really thinking about the outcomes that might have some negative impacts on certain communities. And I'll tie that back to the part that Celestina brought up from the HOG, and the sense that we're moving towards this separation now of key needs and other needs, and focusing on the land use aspects. I think that's another place where we can tend to move backwards into a system where those land use focused actions may not be taking into account those impacts we see on very specific communities. So that's a concern I have about that particular direction and separating them in that way. So I really appreciate the great opportunity to kind of bring that forward and at the end here. So thanks. But I think a concern that we need to watch for as we move forward in how we're processing this. And of course, the details are everything. So thank you all for the work you're doing.
Yeah, thanks, Vice Chair. Well, with that, just remind folks we'll be coming back June 11th, same time, maybe similar link at least. So we'll see you there. Then, as a reminder, we do always send out a post-meeting survey. We do look at those responses. So I'll encourage folks to continue to share. I think we did try, Vice Chair, to your point, and Anita, your reflection, and to really kind of frame this conversation that kind of moved from kind of those broader concerns and impacts and outcomes down into some of the technical realities of how the rules overlay with those. So love to get your feedback on this conversation. It was great to have folks contribute in so many wonderful ways. Ethan?
Thanks, Ben. I just wanted to kind of put a spotlight on those post-meeting surveys. I think one of the great ways to provide feedback is to DLCD is these meetings are a lot, right? These are 3-hour blocks of time, huge. They require processing, reflection, and those post-meeting surveys are a really good place to provide those reflections as you're able to kind of sit through, have conversations, reflect back to the folks in your group or on your team about the things that were discussed here today. And, it's a really good opportunity to say, hey, I was reflecting on this thing on a walk later, and this is important for me. And this is something I want to convey that I didn't have a chance to in the meeting. So definitely want to highlight the value of those post-meeting survey comments.
Thanks, Stephen. So like the combination of both kind of substantive, reflective, and contributive kind of thoughts, as well as any process improvements that you would like to see to make sure that everyone in this space can contribute in the most meaningful way possible. So with that, all as a closing set of thoughts, you get 2 minutes back in your life. Thanks everyone for a robust conversation. Appreciate everybody being here, and much love. Take care.